Before we get into our discussion of the Native American writing that we read for this module, I want to read you an excerpt from Stewart Edward White's The Land of Footprints, a travel book based on his 1908 safari in what then was British East Africa. During the course of a 6-month journey through what was largely untouched, pristine wilderness, White had ample opportunity to come into contact with native African tribesmen, many of whom had never seen a white man before encountering this early safari. Although Stewart Edward White was writing a travel and a sporting narrative instead of a formal anthropological study, he was a remarkably perceptive and articulate writer who took a keen interest in the culture and the lives of the native Africans he met. We can sense that he viewed those he met as fellow human beings whose culture and beliefs were both valid and interesting. White's perspective was in direct contrast to the Puritans on their divine mission to establish the perfect Christian community in the wilderness of New England, a hostile environment they considered to be the devil's territory. The early Puritans believed that most of the Native Americans they met were not only inferior and ignorant savages, but also sinners in league with the devil, and so committed to defeating their great work of establishing the city on the hill that was to be a model of Christian charity. However, you can be sure that this is not the way that the Native Americans thought about themselves. Instead, I'm convinced that their feelings about themselves were very similar to those of any other relatively primitive and indigenous people whose country has been invaded by a technologically advanced culture, perhaps not unlike the native Africans around 1908. As I read Stewart Edward White's comments on the native Africans he met on his 1908 safari along Africa's Rift Valley, try to imaginatively transpose what he is saying onto the Native American Indians along America's eastern seaboard when they first began to encounter the English colonists in the 16th and the 1700s. The following excerpt is from Stewart Edward White's The Land of Footprints, New York, 1912. Quote, "We are fond of calling these people primitive. In the world standard of measurement, they are primitive, very primitive indeed. But ordinarily by that term, we mean also undeveloped, embryonic. In that sense, we are wrong. Instead of being at the very dawn of human development, these people are at the end, as far as they themselves are concerned. The original racial impulse that started them down the years toward development has fulfilled its duty and spent its force. They have worked out all their problems, established all their customs, arranged the world and its phenomenon in a philosophy to their complete satisfaction. They have lived, ethnologists tell us, for thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, just as we find them today. From our standpoint, that is in a hopeless intellectual darkness, for they know absolutely nothing of the most elementary subjects of knowledge. From their standpoint, however, they have reached the highest desirable pinnacle of human development. Nothing remains to be changed. Their customs, religions, and duties have been worked out and immutably established long ago, and nobody dreams of questioning either their wisdom or their imperative necessity. They are the conservatives of the world. Nor must we conclude, looking at them with the eyes of our own civilization, that the savage is, from his standpoint, lazy and idle. His life is laid out more rigidly than ours will be for a great many thousand years. From childhood to old age, he performs his every act in accord with prohibitions and requirements. He must remember them all, for ignorance does not divert consequences. He must observe them all in pain of terrible punishments. For example, never may he cultivate on the side of a grave, and the plants that spring up from it must never be cut. He must make certain complicated offerings before venturing to harvest a crop. On crossing the first stream of a journey, he must touch his lips with the end of his whetted bow. wade across, drop a stone on the far side, and then drink. If he cuts his nails, he must throw the parings into a thicket. If he drink from a stream and cross it also, he must eject a mouthful of water back into the stream. He must be particularly careful not to look his mother-in-law in the face. Hundreds of omens by the manner of their happening may modify actions, as on what side of the road a woodpecker calls, or in which direction a hyena or jackal crosses the path, how the ground-bill hornbill flies or alights, and the like. He must notice these things and change his plans accordingly to their occurrence. If he does not notice them, they exercise their influence just the same. This does not encourage a distrait mental attitude. These people have passed through the struggles of their formative period to the ultimate highest perfection of adjustment to material and spiritual environment of which they were capable. End of quote. One thing that stands out in all of this is that the Africans White describes, and probably the indigenous American natives as well, had a reverential view of nature. Both people viewed themselves as integral, participative parts of the natural world that surrounded them. And finally, I would ask you to examine carefully this image for this section of Module 4's lecture that also appears on the third page of prints following page 678 in your Norton Anthology, Volume 1. Here we see something of the complexity of Native American life in a North Carolina village in 1585. I think it's very likely that the Native American Indians of New England were just as well organized and just as sophisticated as these in this painting by John White. Note how orderly the village buildings are laid out. Note how each area seems designed for a specific purpose and activity. And perhaps even more importantly, note how all of the Indians in the painting are engaged in some type of organized behavior. Even in the hunting scene at the top of the picture, we see that some serve as drivers and others as bowmen. I would argue that the Indians in this well-organized, neatly arranged Native American village are far removed from the false stereotype of savages. However, these early Native Americans could not write, and few had anything remotely approaching a formalized written language. In regard to the Native American material we read for this module, I think it's important to realize that with only one exception, Samson Occam's autobiography, the speeches reprinted in your textbook were translated and transcribed by white men and not written by the Native American Indians who are alleged to have spoken them. As your textbook cautions on the bottom of page 221, the last sentence, and I quote, "We have Occam's text as he wrote it, but the text we have of Native American oratory were produced by hands other than those of the orators themselves and vary widely in terms of their authenticity and accuracy. Some famous speeches are now known to be largely or entirely invented, while others almost surely represent the words actually spoken by an Indian person." Even so, I think that we can safely accept these oral transcriptions as valid, even though perhaps not entirely accurate, if for no other reason than the high level of consistency in their messages. In other words, they all say nearly the same thing. First, we were friendly toward the whites, and now they are driving us from our ancestral lands. We must therefore organize ourselves into an army and destroy them. As we noted earlier in Mary Rowlandson's narrative, King Philip's War from 1675 to 1676 marked the Indians' final, desperate, but unsuccessful attempt at stemming the tide of European expansion. Later on in the course, I shall deliver a proper full introduction to the archetypal American Benjamin Franklin. But for right now, let us simply consider the preface that he wrote for the 25th anniversary issue of his Poor Richard's Almanac in 1758, 18 years before the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776. It's called The Way to Wealth, and most students agree that it should be required reading for anyone who wants to get a credit card. First of all, let us consider the theme, or the underlying ideological assumption, or the main idea that Benjamin Franklin takes for granted and which prompted him to sit down and write this famous essay. And it is that idea, the theme, which informs the essay's dominant rhetorical purpose. Recall for a moment the theme of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Edwards' theme in that famous sermon was that everyone who had not been saved and born again in Christ is in imminent danger of eternal damnation. That theme in turn informed the dominant rhetorical purpose of the sermon, which was to convince all who had not accepted Christ as Savior to do so without delay and thereby be saved from eternal torment. While Franklin's delivery in The Way to Wealth is not nearly so frightening as Edwards', Franklin's theme, or underlying ideological assumption, is equally clear. Paraphrasing a great writer is always risky, but I shall nevertheless try to summarize the essential truth or assumption that lies behind what Franklin had to say. One way to state that essential truth or assumption is to say that no matter who you are or how poor you are, you can better yourself financially if you follow Poor Richard's advice for incorporating into every facet of one's life the virtues of industry, frugality, and diligence. If we accept the statement as the essay's theme or basic assumption, what is the dominant rhetorical purpose that it informs, and how might we state that as the thesis for an essay? In other words, what is the essay trying to convince its readers to do? In formulating a thesis for a successful essay, try to think about it as if you were a lawyer addressing a jury, and preface your remarks in your mind, not in your essay, with something like this. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I shall prove beyond a reasonable doubt that in The Way to Wealth, Benjamin Franklin intended to convince his readers that by exercising the virtues of industry, frugality, and prudence, and by asking God's blessing for himself and his family, anyone can improve his or her financial lot in life. This rhetorical statement, this argument, if you will, of what Benjamin Franklin was trying to do in his essay would constitute an excellent foundation for the thesis in a critical essay like the one you will write for me later on in the term. If you were writing about The Way to Wealth, all you would have to do is to follow this thesis with a sentence or two explaining how you intended to demonstrate your argument, and you would have the makings of a very credible introduction. In short and in brief, how well you do on your critical essay will depend in very large part on how well you have formulated your thesis statement and on how thoroughly you have supported that argument with specific references to the text of your selected novel. Finally, as stated in the syllabus, I have posted a full-length example of what an A paper looks like in the course documents section of Blackboard. I would strongly encourage you to examine it carefully in terms of its introduction, its thesis, and its supporting evidence. And remember, too, that an essay is an attempt. It is an attempt to convince its readers to take some type of action or to adopt some particular point of view. It may contain explanations and point out similarities, but only insofar as these elements serve to support its thesis. Anything else is irrelevant. I've read your diagnostic essays, and you've already demonstrated that you're fully capable of going into great detail about your favorite person, pet, or place. You already have the linguistic sophistication to do well on your essay, and I want you to do well. It's very important to me that you do well. What I'm asking you to do, and all I'm asking you to do, is simply to transfer your pre-existing rhetorical skills and your manifest, meticulous sense of detail to the composition of your critical essay. I have every confidence that you can do so. As a final note, don't forget that your response papers are due and safe assigned by 12 o'clock noon on 18 October 2018. Before you begin to edit the final draft, be sure to review the requirements of the assignment on the syllabus.